The moving van rumbled down the quiet suburban street, its engine disrupting the stillness of the late afternoon. Madison Daniels sat in the back seat of her father's sedan, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she stared out the window. The houses on Maple Lane were tidy and well kept, their lawns trimmed with meticulous care. It was the kind of neighborhood her parents had always dreamed of, a place where the air smelled clean. The schools were good, and opportunity seemed to linger around every corner. Her father, Robert, was visibly proud, his shoulders squared as he steered the car into their new driveway. "This is it, Maddie," he said, his voice carrying the kind of optimism that only comes with hard-earned progress. "A fresh start, better schools, better chances, everything we've worked for." Her mother, Angela, reached back from the front seat to give Maddie's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to love it here," she said with a smile. "It's going to be a little different, but that's what makes it exciting." Maddie offered a small smile in return, but she didn't share her parents' certainty. Her gaze lingered on the street outside, where neighbors were stepping out of their homes to peek at the new arrivals. There were no smiles or welcoming waves, just the quiet curiosity of people assessing whether the newcomers belonged. Maddie noticed the way their eyes lingered on her father's face, on her mother's, and finally on hers. It wasn't hostility. Not exactly. But it wasn't warm, either. "Let's get started," Robert said, cutting the engine. His voice carried the kind of determination that suggested he wouldn't notice, or couldn't afford to notice. The lack of welcome. Maddie followed her parents as they unloaded the car. She kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand. The Daniels family worked in a steady rhythm, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture with the efficiency of people who'd moved too many times before. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, the house had started to feel like theirs, even if the neighborhood still didn't. The next morning, Maddie stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her crisp white shirt. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and uncertain. Today was her first day at Bridgewood Academy, a private high school with a reputation as polished as its marble hallways. "You'll be fine," her mother said from the doorway, her voice soft but firm. "Just be yourself, sweetheart." Maddie nodded, though she wasn't sure if being herself was what Bridgewood wanted. The school was known for its excellence, its high test scores, and its alumni who went on to do great things. It wasn't known for its diversity. Maddie had seen the photos on the school's website, rows of smiling faces, almost all of them pale. She had a feeling she'd stand out more than she'd fit in. Bridgewood Academy was everything Maddie expected and nothing she hoped for. The hallways gleamed under fluorescent lights, the air filled with the chatter of students who seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Maddie felt their eyes on her as she navigated the corridors, clutching her schedule like a lifeline. It wasn't open hostility, but something quieter and harder to pinpoint, a kind of scrutiny that made her feel like she'd been placed under a magnifying glass. Her first class was history. The room fell silent as she entered, the teacher pausing mid-sentence to look up from her notes. Mrs. Caldwell was tall and severe, her gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked like it might ache. She regarded Maddie with a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Class, this is Madison Daniels," she announced. "She's joining us from," where was it again? Maddie's voice faltered for a moment before she found it. "Atlanta." "Ah," Mrs. Caldwell said, drawing the syllable out like she was tasting it. "Well, welcome to Bridgewood." Maddie nodded, her cheeks flushing as she took an empty seat near the back. The lesson resumed, but Maddie barely heard a word. The students around her whispered in voices just low enough to avoid the teacher's attention, their eyes darting toward her like she was some kind of curiosity. "She's so quiet," someone murmured. "She'll have to be," another replied, their tone edged with a subtle cruelty Maddie wasn't sure she was meant to hear. By the time lunch rolled around, Maddie's nerves were raw. The cafeteria was loud and bustling, filled with clusters of students who already seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Maddie scanned the room for an empty table but found none. Steeling herself, she approached a group of girls sitting near the window. "Is it okay if I sit here?" she asked, her voice careful. One of the girls, blonde and impeccably dressed, barely looked up. Sure, she said flatly, before returning to her conversation. Maddie sat and unpacked her lunch. But it quickly became clear she wasn't welcome. The girls leaned closer to each other, their whispers just loud enough for Maddie to catch snippets. Who does she think she is? She doesn't belong here. The words settled on Maddie's chest like stones. She stared down at her sandwich. Her appetite gone. She wanted to say something. But what could she say? Anything she might have replied felt small and powerless in the face of their disdain. By the time the final bell rang, Maddie was exhausted in a way that had little to do with the schoolwork. As she walked home, the weight of the day pressed down on her, each step heavier than the last. Her parents greeted her with smiles and questions about her first day. Their voices filled with hope and pride. Maddie didn't have the heart to tell them the truth. Not yet. Instead, she forced a smile and told them it was fine. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Maddie knew it wasn't fine. She had come to Bridgewood hoping for a new beginning. But all she'd found was a new version of the same old story. A story she wasn't sure she had the strength to rewrite. The second day at Bridgewood Academy began much like the first, the morning sun casting a golden glow on the manicured lawns. The air crisp and still. Madison Daniels walked up the school steps, her backpack feeling heavier than it had the day before. She reminded herself of her mother's words as she had left the house. Give it time. Maddie, change takes time. She had nodded, not wanting to admit that it wasn't the adjustment to a new school that troubled her. It was the way the air at Bridgewood seemed charged with an unspoken tension. One that no amount of time could dissolve. The history classroom was as orderly and sterile as Maddie remembered. Mrs. Caldwell was already at the front, her posture as rigid as the lines of chalk on the blackboard. The students shuffled to their seats, their chatter soft but purposeful. Maddie took her place near the back, clutching her notebook like a shield. Mrs. Caldwell began the lesson with her usual clipped efficiency, reviewing the assigned reading on early civilizations. Maddie had stayed up late the night before, carefully annotating the text and preparing questions she hoped might impress her teacher. When Mrs. Caldwell posed a question to the class, Maddie hesitated only briefly before raising her hand. The room stilled. All eyes seemed to turn toward her. Some curious, others faintly amused. Mrs. Caldwell's gaze lingered on Maddie for a moment before she sighed, her expression one of exaggerated patience. Yes, Madison, she said, her tone bordering on condescending. Maddie swallowed and began to answer, her voice measured and calm. Halfway through, she stumbled over a term. Her nerves catching up with her. And tried to recover. But Mrs. Caldwell was already shaking her head. Let's make sure we're fully prepared before we volunteer next time, the teacher said, her voice cool but loud enough for the entire class to hear. It's important to set a high standard here. The words were spoken without malice, but they landed heavily. Maddie felt a flush creep up her neck, the heat rising to her cheeks as she lowered her gaze to her notebook. The room was silent except for the faint sound of snickers from a few rows ahead. Anyone else? Mrs. Caldwell continued, scanning the room as though Maddie had not spoken at all. Lunch brought no reprieve. Maddie's footsteps echoed down the polished floors of the cafeteria as she carried her tray, searching for a place to sit. Yesterday's experience had taught her to approach with caution, but caution offered little comfort in a room full of strangers who watched her as if she didn't quite belong. She spotted a table where a group of girls sat, laughing and talking. One of them glanced her way, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she turned back to her friends. Maddie stopped mid-step, pretending she hadn't seen. Instead, she found an empty table by the window and sat alone, her tray untouched. Across the room, clusters of students seemed to fit seamlessly into their surroundings, their voices rising and falling in familiar rhythms. Maddie listened to their laughter, their inside jokes, their plans for after school. None of it included her. She wasn't surprised. She had felt this before. In the way neighbors had looked at her family when they moved in the way clerks at the local grocery store had hesitated just a beat too long before returning her father's change. It wasn't the kind of rejection you could name or call out. It was quieter than that, almost imperceptible, like a draft slipping through a closed window. In the afternoon, Maddie's schedule brought her to biology. The teacher, Mr. Benson, was friendlier than Mrs. Caldwell. His voice animated as he discussed the upcoming group project. Maddie found herself assigned to a team of 3. Owen, a tall boy with an air of casual arrogance, Sarah, a blonde girl who seemed perpetually unimpressed, and Jason, who slouched in his seat as though the entire world bored him. As they gathered at their table, Maddie attempted to contribute. I think we could start by breaking the topic into sections, she suggested, her voice even but tentative. Owen rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair. Sure, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Because you're the expert. Sarah smirked, folding her arms. Maybe just let us handle it, she said. We've got this. Jason muttered something under his breath, too low for Maddie to catch. But the derisive laughter that followed left little doubt about its intent. Maddie froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She wanted to push back, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she forced her gaze downward and focused on the notebook in front of her, scribbling aimlessly to keep her hands busy. The rest of the class passed in a blur of quiet humiliation. The weight of her group's dismissal pressed down on her, heavy and familiar. By the time the bell rang, Maddie was already halfway out the door, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. That evening, her parents asked about her day over dinner. Maddie smiled and said it was fine, her voice steady enough to deflect further questions. But later, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the day replayed in her mind. The sharpness of Mrs. Caldwell's sigh, the cutting tone of Owen's voice, the subtle shifts in Sarah's expression. It wasn't overt, she reminded herself. No one had shouted or slang insults. No one had called her names or told her outright that she didn't belong. But that was what made it harder to bear. The hostility wasn't loud enough to confront, only quiet enough to endure. Maddie rolled onto her side, pulling the blanket tightly around her. Outside, the suburban street was silent. The houses darkened under the weight of sleep. It was a quiet place. Her father had said, a safe place. But as Maddie closed her eyes, she wondered if silence was always a comfort, or if, sometimes, it could be a weapon. The third day at Bridgewood Academy unfolded under an overcast sky. The kind of morning that blurred edges and dulled colors. Madison Daniels walked into the school building, her steps steady but hesitant. She had told herself to push forward, to keep her head up. But the memory of yesterday's stares and whispers lingered, a weight she couldn't quite shrug off. As she passed through the crowded halls, Maddie was reminded of how seamlessly everyone else seemed to fit. Groups of students leaned against lockers, laughing in a way that spoke of easy familiarity. Teachers nodded to them as they passed, their smiles warm and unforced. Maddie didn't expect hostility. Not outright. But she had hoped, at least, for neutrality. Instead, she felt invisible, except for the occasional glance that suggested she had somehow stepped into a place that wasn't meant for her. At lunch, Maddie hesitated by the cafeteria doors. The thought of sitting alone again, of navigating that awkward space where her presence was tolerated but not welcomed, was almost enough to send her to the library instead. But she forced herself to walk in, tray in hand, scanning the room for a quiet corner. It was then that she saw them, a small group of 3 students at a table near the back. There was something unassuming about them, something different from the loud, confident clusters that dominated the room. One of them, a black girl with curly hair tied back into a loose ponytail, caught Maddie's eye and smiled. It was a small gesture, but it carried warmth, an unspoken invitation. Maddie approached cautiously. Hi, she said, her voice tentative. Is it okay if I sit here? Of course, the girl said, motioning to the empty seat across from her. I'm Jasmine, and this is Amir and Grace. Amir, a boy with dark, thoughtful eyes, nodded in greeting, while Grace, a pale, freckled girl with a relaxed demeanor, offered a quick smile. Maddie sat down, her movements careful, unsure of how much space to take up. You're new, right? Jasmine asked, leaning forward slightly. I saw you in the hallway yesterday. Yeah, Maddie replied. Just moved here. Well, welcome to Bridgewood, Amir said, though his tone carried a hint of irony. It's an interesting place. Grace chuckled softly. That's one way to put it. Dash dash dash. As they talked, Maddie began to relax. The conversation flowed easily, shifting from introductions to shared frustrations about school. Jasmine spoke about the subtle ways she felt out of place at Bridgewood. The unspoken expectations that seemed to hang over students who didn't fit the mold. Amir shared stories of teachers who seemed to struggle with his name, pronouncing it differently every time as though the effort wasn't worth it. Even Grace, who Maddie had assumed would have no trouble blending in, mentioned the occasional sideways comments she got for standing up for others. They like to keep things the way they are, Jasmine said, her voice calm but edged with a quiet defiance. And people like us? We don't really fit into their picture. Maddie nodded, the words resonating more deeply than she had expected. For the first time since arriving at Bridgewood, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. These three understood, not just the surface-level challenges, but the quieter, heavier truths beneath them. Dash dash dash. As lunch wound down, Grace leaned back in her chair, studying Maddie thoughtfully. You're braver than you think, she said. It's not easy to walk into a place like this and keep showing up. Maddie blinked, caught off guard by the comment. She hadn't thought of herself as brave, just determined. Or maybe stubborn. But Grace's words stayed with her, even as the bell rang and the group dispersed to their respective classes. Dash dash dash. That afternoon, Maddie walked the halls with a little more steadiness in her step. She still felt the weight of the stairs, still heard the whispers that trailed behind her. But she also felt the beginnings of something else, a quiet resilience. A reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. As she sat through biology class, where Owen and Sarah continued to ignore her contributions with thinly veiled condescension, Maddie thought of Jasmine's words. Asterisk. They like to keep things the way they are. It wasn't just about her. The discomfort, the exclusion. It was part of something larger. Something that stretched far beyond the walls of Bridgewood Academy. When the final bell rang, Maddie packed her things and headed for the door. Outside, the sky was still overcast, the air cool and heavy with the promise of rain. She spotted Jasmine, Amir, and Grace talking near the bike racks, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. For the first time in days, Maddie smiled. It was a small harbor, this group of three, but it was enough. The morning began like any other. The corridors of Bridgewood Academy bustled with students clutching books and half-finished assignments. Madison Daniels walked toward her history class, the rhythm of her steps slower than the tide of movement around her. She had learned to move carefully here, to observe before acting, to speak only when necessary. When she stepped into Mrs. Caldwell's classroom, she felt the familiar wave of unease. The air seemed heavier in this space, laden with expectations that never felt meant for her. Mrs. Caldwell stood at the front, her posture as rigid as ever, her gray eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that didn't miss much but often chose to ignore certain things. Maddie slipped into her usual seat at the back, avoiding the gazes of her classmates. She pulled out her notebook, its worn edges a quiet testament to her attempts to keep up, to meet the unspoken standard that always seemed just out of reach. Dash dash dash. The lesson began without incident. Mrs. Caldwell droned on about primary sources and historical context, her voice clipped and deliberate. Maddie tried to focus, her pen moving across the page in neat, careful lines. But as the minutes ticked by, she felt the subtle shifts around her, the low murmurs, the suppressed laughter. She didn't need to look up to know that. Once again, she was the subject of quiet amusement. Madison. Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through the room suddenly, pulling Maddie's attention upward. Could you come here for a moment? Maddie froze. Her first instinct was to glance around, hoping the request was meant for someone else. But Mrs. Caldwell's eyes were locked on hers, and there was no mistaking the firm edge in her tone. Slowly, Maddie rose from her seat, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her as she walked to the front. Mrs. Caldwell stood with a pair of scissors in her hand, the silver blades catching the light. Your hair, she said, her voice cool and matter-of-fact. It's distracting. Maddie blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. Her hand instinctively went to her braids. The smooth, careful rows that her mother had spent hours perfecting. Distracting, she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Mrs. Caldwell said, her tone sharper now. This is a classroom, not a fashion show. We need to maintain an environment conducive to learning. The words were clinical, devoid of anger or obvious malice. But they stung all the same. Maddie opened her mouth to respond. But nothing came out. What could she say? The quiet authority in Mrs. Caldwell's voice left no room for argument. Without waiting for Maddie's consent, Mrs. Caldwell reached forward, her grip firm as she took hold of one of Maddie's braids. The room was silent except for the faint, metallic snip of the scissors. Maddie felt the weight of the braid leave her, the absence as sharp as the blades themselves. Another snip, and another. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness, punctuated only by the faint rustle of students shifting in their seats. No one spoke, no one moved. Maddie stood frozen, her body stiff, her mind racing to process what was happening. When Mrs. Caldwell finally stepped back, her expression was one of clinical satisfaction. There, she said, placing the scissors back on her desk. That's better. Maddie raised a trembling hand to her head, her fingers brushing against the uneven strands where her braids had been. She couldn't bring herself to look at the pile of hair on the floor. The room around her seemed distant, blurred by a haze of disbelief and humiliation. The spell was broken by a voice from the back of the room. That's not right, Jasmine said, her tone steady but firm. She rose from her seat, her eyes locked on Mrs. Caldwell. Amir and Grace followed suit, their faces set with quiet determination. You can't just do that, Amir said. You can't treat someone like that. Mrs. Caldwell's expression darkened. Sit down, she said sharply. This is not a debate. But the three of them didn't move. This isn't about rules, Grace said, her voice calm but unyielding. It's about respect. And you're not showing it. The murmurs in the room grew louder now, a ripple of uncertainty spreading through the students. Maddie felt Jasmine's hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the midst of the chaos. She wanted to say something, to add her voice to theirs. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with the weight of everything she was feeling. By the time they reached the principal's office, the four of them were met with a mixture of exasperation and dismissal. Principal Hayes listened with a furrowed brow as Jasmine and Amir recounted what had happened. But his tone was measured and detached when he finally spoke. This is a serious accusation, he said, his fingers steepled on the desk. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Caldwell before making any decisions. But what about Maddie? Grace asked, her voice edged with frustration. She's the one who's been humiliated. Principal Hayes sighed, his gaze shifting to Maddie. We'll handle this appropriately, he said, but for now, I need you all to return to class. We can't disrupt the learning environment any further. The words landed heavily, their weight compounded by the unspoken message beneath them. This isn't important enough to disrupt the status quo. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Maddie sat through her classes, her head down, her thoughts spinning in endless circles. When the final bell rang, she gathered her things in silence, her movements slow and mechanical. Outside, the sky had darkened, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. Jasmine, Amir, and Grace waited for her near the bike racks, their expressions somber but resolute. You're not alone in this, Jasmine said, her voice low but steady. We'll figure it out. Maddie nodded, though the words felt distant. As she walked home, the rain soaking into her clothes, she couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Caldwell's scissors glinting in the light, or the sound of her braids hitting the floor. It wasn't just the act itself that lingered. It was the silence that had followed. The way the room had watched and said nothing. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Maddie felt the weight of that silence pressing down on her. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, in the spaces between words, in the things left unsaid. It was a reminder of the quiet power of exclusion, and how it could cut just as deeply as any blade. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the morning air damp and heavy. The streets leading to Bridgewood Academy were slick with water, reflecting the gray clouds overhead. Madison Daniels walked with her shoulders hunched against the chill, her hair uneven and hidden under the hood of her sweatshirt. She didn't want anyone to see. Not her classmates, not her teachers, and especially not herself in the mirror of a passing car. Her father had noticed, of course. He always did. But Maddie had brushed off his concern with a weak excuse about a group project and a mishap in class. She couldn't bring herself to explain. How could she? Words couldn't capture the humiliation. The sense of something precious being taken from her without permission. The school day began quietly. Maddie kept her head down, her voice low when called upon. Even Jasmine, Amir, and Grace seemed subdued, their usual warmth tempered by the unspoken weight of the previous day. Maddie felt the change but didn't know how to address it. It was easier to sit in silence, letting the minutes pass. In biology, the group project was underway. Owen and Sarah whispered to each other as if Maddie weren't there. Their words sharp but just quiet enough to avoid being overheard. Jason slouched in his chair, throwing occasional glances her way, his smirk a constant reminder that he was watching, waiting for her to stumble. Maddie forced herself to focus on her notes, her pen moving in steady lines across the page. She had learned to block out the noise, to pretend the stares didn't burn or the laughter didn't sting. It was a survival tactic, one she had honed over years of being the new face in old spaces. At lunch, Maddie joined Jasmine, Amir, and Grace at their usual table. The cafeteria buzzed with its familiar energy, the sound of hundreds of conversations blending into a dull roar. Maddie picked at her sandwich, her appetite dulled by the memory of Mrs. Caldwell's voice, clinical and detached as she dismissed her dignity with a single sentence. "They can't get away with this," Jasmine said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence at their table. She looked at Maddie, her expression firm. "You know that, right?" Maddie shrugged, her gaze fixed on her tray. "What can I do?" she said quietly. "It's not like anyone cares." Amir leaned forward, his tone measured but insistent. "That's not true," he said. "We care, and I'm pretty sure your dad would care too. If you told him." Maddie winced at the mention of her father. She had been careful to keep him in the dark, to shield him from the mess she had walked into at Bridgewood. He had worked so hard to get her here, to give her this chance. How could she tell him it wasn't what he had hoped? The afternoon brought another encounter with Mrs. Caldwell. This time, it was during a discussion about civil rights movements. The class was tasked with analyzing the impact of grassroots activism, and Maddie had prepared her notes carefully, hoping to contribute without drawing too much attention. When she raised her hand, Mrs. Caldwell hesitated for a fraction of a second before calling on her. "Yes, Madison," she said, her tone neutral. Maddie spoke carefully, her words measured. She referenced her notes, highlighting the role of community leaders in sparking change. But before she could finish, Mrs. Caldwell cut her off. "Thank you, Madison," she said, her voice sharp with finality. "But let's not overreach. We're focusing on the broader picture here, not personal interpretations." The words hung in the air, a quiet dismissal. Maddie felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck as the room shifted uncomfortably. No one said anything. No one ever did. That evening, Maddie sat at the kitchen table with her father. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of silverware. Her father watched her carefully, his brow furrowed in concern. "How was school today?" he asked, his voice steady but probing. "Fine," Maddie replied automatically, focusing on her plate. He set down his fork. "Maddie," he said gently, "talk to me. What's going on?" She hesitated, her hands tightening around her napkin. The words she had been holding back for days threatened to spill out, but the weight of them felt too heavy. Finally, she sighed, her voice barely audible. "It's just hard, that's all." Her father studied her, his expression softening. "Hard how?" he asked. Maddie looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. "People here, they don't see me," she said. "Or if they do, it's like I don't belong." Her father's face tightened, his jaw clenching. Is someone giving you trouble? He asked. His tone sharper now. She shook her head quickly. It's not like that, she said. It's just little things. Things they say, the way they act. It's not anything I can point to. But it's there. Her father reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. Maddie, he said, his voice steady. You don't have to carry this alone. If something's wrong, I need to know. Maddie nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could make things better. But the quiet power of the unspoken was hard to fight. Harder still to explain. That night, Maddie lay awake in her room. The words of the day replaying in her mind. She thought of Jasmine's defiance, Amir's quiet resolve, Grace's unwavering support. She thought of her father, his hand on hers, his voice filled with a strength she wished she could summon in herself. The silence in her room was heavy. But it wasn't empty. It carried the echoes of everything she hadn't said, everything she wished she could change. And as she closed her eyes, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would find her voice. Even if it took time. Because the weight of silence was too much to bear alone. The days at Bridgewood Academy passed with a strange rhythm. One Maddie Daniels had come to understand but never truly adapted to. The school moved like clockwork. Its halls and classrooms following a quiet routine that rarely shifted. But beneath that surface lay something more rigid than order. An unspoken code that determined who fit and who didn't. It was in the small things, Maddie thought, as she walked to class. In the way her name was said with faint hesitation during roll call. In how people glanced at her braids, or what was left of them, before quickly looking away. It wasn't overt. That was the thing about places like Bridgewood. The unkindness was subtle, woven into the fabric of the day. So natural that most people didn't even notice it. That morning, Mrs. Caldwell handed back essays from their latest assignment. Maddie's paper came with a single word written at the top. Adequate. The word sat heavily on the page. More a dismissal than a critique. She flipped through the rest of her essay, searching for comments, suggestions, anything to help her improve. But there was nothing. Just adequate. Maddie glanced around. Other students were murmuring, comparing notes. Owen's paper had a detailed note at the bottom. Excellent work. Your argument was well constructed and thoughtful. Sarah had a paragraph of praise. But Maddie's paper, filled with the same careful research and effort, was dismissed with a single word. She tucked the essay into her notebook, feeling a quiet burn of frustration. It wasn't the first time her work had been brushed aside. And she doubted it would be the last. At lunch, Maddie sat with Jasmine, Amir, and Grace. Their table had become her refuge. A small bubble of safety in the storm of the school day. Today, though, even their conversation felt muted. Did anyone else notice Mrs. Caldwell's mood today? Amir asked, poking at his food with a plastic fork. Grace shrugged. She's always like that. No, Jasmine said. It was worse today. She's been tense ever since Maddie's thing last week. Maddie looked up sharply. My thing? Jasmine sighed. You know, the scissors. Maddie winced. She didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to relive the humiliation. But the memory clung to her. As fresh as if it had just happened. People are starting to notice. Amir said quietly. Not just us. Some of the other kids are talking about it. Maddie frowned. What are they saying? Jasmine hesitated. Mostly just questions. Why did she do it? Why did no one stop her? But no one's really taking a stand. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth. At Bridgewood, silence was easier than confrontation. Maddie understood that. She had been silent, too. Later that afternoon, Maddie found herself in the library. A quiet sanctuary away from the noise of the school. She wandered the aisles aimlessly, her fingers brushing the spines of books she didn't have the energy to open. As she turned a corner, she nearly bumped into Mrs. Caldwell. The teacher was standing by the history section, a book in hand. She looked up, her expression momentarily surprised before settling into its usual neutrality. Madison, Mrs. Caldwell said, her tone as clipped as ever. What are you doing here? Maddie hesitated. Just looking for something to read. Mrs. Caldwell nodded, then glanced down at the book she was holding. You might find this interesting, she said, holding it out. Maddie took it cautiously. It was a biography of Frederick Douglass. Its cover worn but clean. She looked up at Mrs. Caldwell, unsure what to say. History is full of people who overcame adversity, Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice measured. You might find it inspiring. There was no malice in her words, but they stung all the same. Maddie forced a polite nod and turned away, clutching the book to her chest. It wasn't until she reached the other side of the library that she realized why her hands were shaking. When Maddie got home that evening, her father was waiting for her in the living room. He looked up from the newspaper as she walked in, his expression softening. Hey, he said, how was school? Maddie shrugged. It was fine. He set the paper down. Maddie, he said gently, we need to talk. She froze. About what? Her father hesitated, his hands resting on his knees. I got a call from the school board today. They're investigating what happened with Mrs. Caldwell. Maddie's stomach twisted. Why? Because it's serious, he said. What she did to you. It's not right. Maddie. And they know that. Maddie sank into the chair opposite him, her hands clutching the edges of her backpack. I didn't ask them to do that, she said quietly. I know, her father replied. But it's not just about you. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. To anyone. The words settled over her like a weight. She had tried so hard to stay invisible, to blend into the background. But now, the cracks in Bridgewood's facade were starting to show. And she was at the center of it. That night, Maddie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The biography of Frederick Douglass sat on her bedside table, unopened. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell, about the word adequate, about the weight of silence that had followed her since the day her braids were cut. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But fairness, Maddie realized, wasn't something she could expect. It was something she would have to fight for, even if it meant stepping into the uncomfortable spotlight she had tried so hard to avoid. The thought terrified her, but as the night stretched on, a quiet determination began to grow. If the cracks were already there, maybe it was time to widen them. The days following the school board's investigation were a peculiar mix of tension and routine. For Madison Daniels, the halls of Bridgewood Academy felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. Whispers followed her as she walked between classes, the kind of muted murmurs that carried curiosity, judgment, and sometimes a faint edge of sympathy. She kept her head down, her movements deliberate, her voice low. It was easier to retreat, to stay invisible, but invisibility had become a fragile shield, one that seemed ready to shatter with each passing day. In history class, Mrs. Caldwell carried on as if nothing had changed. She moved through her lectures with the same clipped efficiency, her tone as sharp and authoritative as ever. But something in her demeanor had shifted. She avoided looking at Maddie directly, her gaze skating past her as if she wasn't there. The absence of attention was almost as cutting as the moments when Mrs. Caldwell's criticism had been too pointed. Maddie noticed the way her classmates reacted, too. Some leaned into their desks, exchanging quiet whispers and knowing glances. Others sat stiffly, their faces carefully blank. No one said anything aloud. But the tension was palpable, an invisible thread that bound them all to the events of the past week. At lunch, Jasmine, Amir, and Grace tried to lift Maddie's spirits. They joked about the new substitute in chemistry who managed to mispronounce nearly every student's name. They shared stories about teachers they admired, who seemed to genuinely care about their students. But even their warmth couldn't fully dispel the chill Maddie felt. They're scared, you know, Amir said quietly, breaking the rhythm of their conversation. Maddie frowned. Who? Mrs. Caldwell, the principal, all of them, Amir said. They know people are paying attention now. Jasmine nodded. And they should be. What happened to you? It's not something they can sweep under the rug. Maddie sighed, her fingers tracing the edges of her tray. It doesn't feel like it's going to change anything, she said. They'll investigate, they'll talk, but then everything will go back to the way it was. Grace reached across the table, her hand brushing Maddie's. Not if you don't let it, she said softly. That afternoon, Maddie sat through another lecture in Mrs. Caldwell's class, her pen moving absently across her notebook. The topic was the civil rights movement, and Mrs. Caldwell spoke with her usual precision, her tone devoid of personal connection. To Maddie, it sounded clinical, like a list of facts rather than the story of a struggle for dignity and equality. She wanted to say something, to ask a question that might cut through the detachment, but her voice caught in her throat, held back by the fear of Mrs. Caldwell's dismissal. Instead, she listened in silence, her thoughts swirling. When the bell rang, Maddie lingered in her seat, watching as her classmates filed out. Mrs. Caldwell glanced up from her desk, her expression briefly unreadable. Do you need something, Madison? She asked, her tone even. Maddie hesitated. No, she said finally. I was just thinking. Mrs. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. About what? Maddie met her gaze, her voice quiet but steady. About how history isn't just facts. It's people, and how what we do now becomes part of it. For a moment, Mrs. Caldwell didn't respond. Then she nodded, her expression carefully neutral. That's true, she said, but sometimes history is also about perspective. The words lingered as Maddie left the room, the unspoken implication settling uneasily in her mind. Perspective could justify a lot of things, she thought, but it didn't make them right. That evening, Maddie sat with her father at the kitchen table. He had been quieter than usual, his focus shifting between his coffee cup and the newspaper spread out in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if he had been rehearsing the words. The school board called me again, he said. They're asking for more details. They want to know if you're willing to talk about what happened. Maddie's stomach tightened. What did you say? I told them it was your decision, he said, meeting her gaze. But Maddie, if you do speak up, you could make a difference. Not just for yourself, but for anyone else who's gone through something like this. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. What if they don't listen? She asked. Her father reached across the table, his hand warm and steady over hers. Then we'll keep talking, he said, because staying silent doesn't change anything. The words settled over her, heavy with truth. Maddie nodded slowly, a flicker of determination igniting in her chest. She wasn't sure what she would say or how she would find the courage. But she knew one thing. She couldn't let this moment pass without trying. The next day, Maddie sat in the library with Jasmine, Amir, and Grace. They were helping her prepare, brainstorming what she could say to the school board. The conversation was serious but not somber, their voices steady with encouragement. You don't have to explain everything, Jasmine said. Just tell them how it felt. Make them understand what it's like to be in your shoes. Focus on the facts, Amir added. They can't argue with what actually happened. Grace nodded. And remember, you're not alone in this. We'll back you up, no matter what. As Maddie listened, she felt a quiet strength building within her. For the first time, she began to believe that her voice mattered, that it could cut through the silence that had surrounded her for so long. When she finally left the library, the sun was setting, casting the school in a warm, golden light. Maddie paused for a moment, taking in the scene. The shadows were still there, stretching long and dark across the ground. But so was the light, soft and persistent, refusing to fade. And Maddie realized that maybe, just maybe, the cracks in Bridgewood's facade were starting to let something brighter shine through. The boardroom at Bridgewood Academy was colder than Maddie expected. She sat in a chair that felt too big, her back straight and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, a long table stretched out, where members of the school board sat in silence. They were older than she had imagined, some with gray hair and kind eyes, others with sharp gazes that made her feel exposed. Her father sat beside her, his steady presence a quiet anchor. Jasmine, Amir, and Grace had wanted to come, but the board had decided the meeting would be closed. Still, Maddie had felt their encouragement in every whispered word of support, every shared look of determination over the past week. The chairwoman of the board, a tall woman with a calm but commanding voice, leaned forward and smiled faintly. Madison, she said, her tone measured. Thank you for coming today. We know this isn't easy. But it's important. Maddie nodded, her throat dry. She had practiced what to say. The words carefully rehearsed in her room, at the kitchen table, and in the quiet of the library. But now, under the weight of so many eyes, they seemed to scatter like leaves in the wind. I want to talk about what happened. Maddie began, her voice soft but steady. Not just to me, but to anyone who feels like they don't belong. The board members exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Maddie continued, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. When Mrs. Caldwell cut my braids, it wasn't just about hair, she said. It was about something deeper. About being made to feel like who I am is wrong. Like I don't have a right to take up space here. She paused, her voice catching. It wasn't the first time I felt that way at Bridgewood. And I know I'm not the only one. There are so many little things, comments, looks, decisions, that make people like me feel invisible. Or worse, unwanted. Her father reached over, his hand resting lightly on her arm. Maddie drew a deep breath, the steady warmth of his presence grounding her. I don't think Mrs. Caldwell thought about what it meant when she did what she did, Maddie said, her voice gaining strength. But that's the problem. People don't think. They don't see how their actions, even the small ones, hurt others. And it keeps happening because no one says anything. The room was quiet, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Maddie let the silence linger, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she added, softly but firmly, but I'm saying something now. The board thanked her for speaking. Their response is a mix of polite acknowledgement and genuine concern. They assured her that her words would guide their decisions moving forward. Though Maddie couldn't tell if their promises carried real weight or if they were simply formalities. Still, as she walked out of the room, she felt lighter. Her father squeezed her shoulder, his pride evident in the faint smile he gave her. You did good, Maddie, he said quietly. You spoke your truth. The truth. It was a simple concept but one that had felt impossible to share for so long. Now that she had, she realized the power it carried. Not just to expose what was wrong, but to make space for something better. In the weeks that followed, the school board's response was slow but deliberate. Mrs. Caldwell was placed on administrative leave while an investigation was conducted. The principal, who had long ignored complaints like Maddie's, was reassigned to another district. Bridgewood began instituting changes, mandatory diversity training for staff, open forums for students to share their concerns, and stricter policies on bullying and discrimination. At first, the changes felt cosmetic, surface-level solutions to a problem too deep to fix with a few workshops and new rules. But over time, Maddie began to notice small shifts. Teachers who had once been distant started making an effort to connect with students. Classmates who had whispered behind her back now approached her with quiet apologies. The tension in the hallways softened, replaced by an unfamiliar but welcome sense of possibility. One afternoon, Maddie found herself sitting in the library with Jasmine, Amir, and Grace. The table was scattered with books and notes, their conversation drifting between homework and plans for the weekend. The air felt lighter, the laughter between them more frequent. You started this, you know, Jasmine said suddenly, her tone matter of fact. Maddie looked up, surprised. What do you mean? All of it, Jasmine said, gesturing vaguely. The changes, the conversations, everything. It started because you spoke up. Maddie shook her head. It wasn't just me, she said. You guys stood by me. My dad, he made sure people listened. Grace smiled. Maybe, but it still took courage. You didn't have to speak up. But you did. That matters. The words sank in slowly, like ripples spreading across still water. Maddie had spent so much time feeling small, invisible, powerless. It was strange to think she had made an impact, that her voice had carried beyond her own experience. As the school year drew to a close, Bridgewood held an assembly to recognize student achievements. Maddie sat quietly in the audience, Content to watch as her classmates walked across the stage to receive awards for academics, sports, and community service. Then, to her surprise, the chairwoman of the school board stepped up to the microphone. This year, we want to recognize a student who showed extraordinary resilience and courage. She said, someone who reminded us all of the importance of speaking up, even when it's difficult. Maddie's name was called, and the room erupted in applause. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, before standing and walking to the stage. The chairwoman handed her a small plaque, her smile warm and genuine. Thank you, Madison, she said softly, for showing us what it means to stand tall. Later, as Maddie and her father walked to their car, the plaque tucked safely in her bag, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, I always knew you were strong. But seeing you up there today, it reminded me just how strong you are. Maddie smiled, the weight of his words settling warmly in her chest. Thanks, Dad, she said. As they drove home, the evening sun cast long shadows across the road. But the light remained. Maddie watched it through the window, feeling, for the first time, like she had found her place. Not just at Bridgewood, but in her own story. She still carried the scars of her experience, the memories of every quiet slight and unspoken judgment. But those scars no longer felt like burdens. They were reminders of what she had endured and what she had overcome. And as the car rolled to a stop in their driveway, Maddie stepped out with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next.